The air was thick with the buzz of tourists and the occasional click of a camera, as the grandeur of Buckingham Palace stood proudly against the clear blue sky. It was a day like any other. The royal guard in his iconic red tunic and tall black hat, stationed unwaveringly in front of the palace. James Harrison, a seasoned soldier, stood at attention, his eyes forward, his movements as rigid and controlled as the palace itself. For him, this was routine. But little did he know, today would be different. As the hours passed, the usual tourists came and went. Some marveled at the timeless beauty of the palace, others took selfies, while a few simply watched the guards with curiosity. But one visitor, a man named Marcus Reed, seemed to have a different agenda. Reed was a stocky man, his arms covered in tattoos that told stories of a life lived on the edge. He was an imposing figure, the type who walked with a certain swagger, as if the world bent to his will. Reed was no ordinary tourist. He had come with one thing in mind, a challenge. At first, his intentions were unclear. He moved through the crowd, a glint of something mischievous in his eyes. His bulldog, Cupcake, was by his side, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its brown and white coat. The dog, despite its somewhat cute name, was anything but sweet. Cupcake had a reputation, tough, territorial, and more than a little aggressive. Reed, however, seemed to enjoy the dog's tenacity, a feeling that was all too familiar to him. As Reed approached Harrison, a crowd began to gather, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. The guard, ever composed, remained focused on his post, his gaze never faltering. But Reed wasn't satisfied with the usual interaction. He had a plan, a provocation. With a slight tug on the leash, Cupcake growled, a deep rumbling sound that cut through the air. Reed's grip tightened around the leash, and with a calculated move, he yanked the dog forward. Cupcake lunged toward Harrison, its teeth bared and eyes fierce. The crowd gasped. A sense of anticipation filled the air, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Reed's face was set in a cruel grin as he watched the scene unfold. "Easy there, Cupcake," Reed muttered, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Get a good look at the toy soldier." Harrison didn't flinch. His expression remained as stoic as ever, but there was a flicker of awareness in his eyes. He knew the situation. He had dealt with similar challenges before. This time, something about the aggression felt different. It was as though Reed wasn't just testing his patience, he was testing his resolve. The crowd, which had been murmuring with excitement, grew silent. The tension was palpable. Would the guard remain unmoved? Or would he react, even if just a little? This was a game, and Reed had set the rules. He was determined to break the guard's unshakable composure, but Harrison, ever the professional, stood his ground. His eyes locked with Reed's, unwavering. The tension between the two men grew as Reed continued to taunt him, urging the dog forward, using the leash to whip Cupcake into a frenzy. The dog snarled, its body taut with aggression, ready to pounce. Yet, Harrison remained perfectly still, not giving Reed the satisfaction of even the slightest twitch. Reed's frustration mounted. His muscles tensed as he yanked the leash harder, trying to coax the dog into a more violent outburst. He was used to intimidating people, used to bending others to his will. But Harrison, stoic and unmoving, was not yielding. The crowd watched, captivated by the battle of wills playing out before them. Just when it seemed like the situation could escalate further, something unexpected happened. The dog, Cupcake, stopped growling. Its attention shifted from Harrison to the crowd, its eyes scanning the faces of the onlookers. There was a moment of confusion, a split second where both man and beast seemed to hesitate. The tension was broken, but the question lingered in the air: who was in control here? In that brief moment of stillness, Harrison spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Take control of your dog, sir." The words were simple, but they carried weight. They were a reminder to Reed that he had crossed a line, that his attempt to provoke had failed. For the first time, Reed looked at the guard with something resembling respect. The game, it seemed, was over. Reed let go of the leash, a low growl escaping his throat as he backed away, his face hardening. He hadn't won. Harrison, without lifting a finger, had defeated him. The crowd, once holding its breath, began to disperse, their murmurs turning to laughter and whispers of admiration for the guard's unyielding composure. As Reed walked away, he cast one last glance at Harrison. There was no shame in his eyes, just a recognition that some people, some forces, couldn't be intimidated. James Harrison, the Royal Guard, had proven that today. He had stood firm, unwavering in the face of aggression, his calm demeanor a testament to the strength of his training and discipline. The crowd slowly began to return to their normal routines, but the story of the day would live on. Tourists would talk about the challenge at Buckingham Palace. About the day when a bulldog and a royal guard faced off, and how the guard emerged victorious without ever moving a muscle. It was a reminder that some challenges weren't meant to be fought with force, but with resolve, patience, and an unbreakable will. For Reed, it was a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Some battles were simply not worth the fight, and for Harrison, it was another day at his post, another challenge that had come and gone, leaving him as stoic and unshaken as ever. James Harrison had always believed that the true test of a royal guard was not simply standing at attention, immobile for hours, but the ability to remain unshaken in the face of unpredictable threats. He had seen it all during his 8 years of military service, riots, protests, and more than one would-be provocateur trying to break his discipline. But nothing had tested his composure quite like the scene unfolding in front of him now. It wasn't just the bulldog, Cupcake, or Reed's muscular, imposing presence. It was the deliberate, almost theatrical way Reed was using the dog. The growls, the strained leash, the calculated lunges, all of it was designed to provoke. The tension was unmistakable. As though Reed was performing for the crowd, pulling the strings of the dog's aggression to direct the emotions of those watching. The crowd was captivated, unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or even step in to stop it. But it was precisely at this moment that Harrison's training, honed over countless drills and operations, kicked in. Harrison didn't need to glance around at the crowd. He knew what was happening. Reed was using Cupcake as a tool for intimidation, manipulating the animal's behavior to shape the crowd's perception of the scene. Harrison understood this tactic all too well. It was a playbook he'd seen used by individuals who believed that force, whether through an animal, a weapon, or an angry outburst, could make people bow to their will. But in the Royal Guard, there was one principle that mattered above all: control. Not just over the situation, but over oneself. Reed's tactic was as clear as it was crude. He knew how to make the crowd react. The way Cupcake growled and lunged, accompanied by Reed's sharp, purposeful commands, was all part of the script. The crowd's nervous laughter and uneasy glances made the scene feel charged, like a live wire teetering on the edge of snapping. Reed wanted a reaction, and he was willing to push until he got one. But Harrison saw through it all. The growls were not just random outbursts, they were calculated. Each snarl, each shift in the dog's stance, was a move in Reed's larger game, a game designed to rattle Harrison and, by extension, challenge the uniformity of the Royal Guard itself. Reed wasn't just testing Harrison's nerves, he was testing his control, hoping to provoke some sign of weakness, a twitch, a glance, anything that could show the guard was human after all. Yet Harrison didn't bite. His eyes remained steady, fixed on Reed with the same calm focus he had mastered during his years of service. It wasn't about fighting the dog. It wasn't about defending himself. It was about maintaining the stance. Not just physically but mentally. Harrison knew that in the face of aggression, the true power was in stillness, in control, in not reacting at all. The dog continued to growl, louder now, its sharp teeth flashing in the sunlight. Cupcake's body rippled with tension, the beast ready to spring into action. But Harrison never flinched. His body was a statue, a living embodiment of the unwavering discipline instilled in him during his training. He'd been taught to read people, to assess their moves without reacting emotionally. He was trained to withstand far worse than this, and Reed's theatrics were nothing more than a challenge to be overcome with the quiet strength of discipline. Reed, on the other hand, was growing more desperate. His attempts to manipulate the dog, to turn Cupcake into a living weapon of intimidation, had not gone unnoticed. Harrison saw the tension in Reed's shoulders, the subtle tightening of his fists around the leash, the faint tremor in his voice as he urged the dog forward. Reed was struggling to keep control over the situation, but Harrison, quiet, steadfast, unflinching, remained a constant in the face of it all. As the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the crowd continued to watch, some in fascination, others in fear. Reed's face twisted into a mask of frustration. He had hoped to break Harrison, to provoke a response, but Harrison remained an immovable wall. Cupcake's growls became more erratic, but the dog's eyes shifted again, away from Harrison, toward the onlookers. It was as though the aggression, the power Reed had tried so hard to control, was slipping from his grasp. Cupcake was no longer focused solely on Harrison. The leash slipped in Reed's hands, and the dog began to calm slightly, sensing the absence of the intense focus Reed had been forcing upon it, in that moment. Reed's face twisted with disbelief. He had pushed the dog as far as he could, but now, even Cupcake was unwilling to keep playing the role of the aggressor. Reed's eyes flicked toward Harrison again, a silent recognition dawning on him. He wasn't going to get the reaction he sought. The royal guard was unbreakable. Then, Harrison spoke again, his voice still calm, but with a firm edge that brooked no argument. "You've made your point, sir. It's time to leave." It wasn't a command, but it was a suggestion that carried weight. Reed's bravado faltered as he looked around at the scattered crowd, who had begun to murmur amongst themselves. The performance he had carefully orchestrated was unraveling in front of him. The crowd, once unsure, now saw the truth. They had been witnesses to something rare, a man who had remained composed in the face of aggression, a man whose strength didn't come from violence but from unyielding control. Reed, the once dominant figure, was now merely a man holding a leash to a dog that had lost its bite. He pulled the leash back, his face hardening with reluctant respect. He hadn't won. But he hadn't lost, either, at least, not yet. He nodded once, briefly, to Harrison, his pride still intact but the tension gone from his shoulders. As Reed walked away, Harrison didn't watch him leave. His eyes were back on the crowd, his posture as rigid as ever. The moment had passed, but the lesson lingered. Not all challenges were meant to be fought with fists or fury. Some were best met with silence, with stillness. And in that silence, in that stillness, true strength was revealed. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring in admiration for the guard who had stood unmoving, unshaken, even as the storm of aggression raged around him. For James Harrison, it was just another day at his post. But for everyone else who had witnessed it, it was a reminder that the greatest strength is often the ability to remain calm when the world demands you react. And as the crowd faded, one thing was clear: Harrison had passed the test, and Marcus Reed had learned something he wouldn't soon forget. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace shifted. What had started as a tense but contained encounter between a royal guard and an overzealous tourist was now escalating. The crowd, once captivated by the initial growls of Cupcake, began to gather in larger numbers, sensing that something more dramatic was unfolding. Reed, whose initial attempts to provoke Harrison had failed, was growing more impatient by the second. His face, flushed with frustration, twisted as he tightened his grip on the leash. "Come on, Cupcake. Let's show him what you're made of," Reed barked, his voice now rising above the murmurs of the crowd. He yanked on the leash once again, pulling the dog forward with all the force he could muster. The bulldog, sensing Reed's mounting aggression, responded in kind, snarling with even more intensity, its teeth flashing in the sunlight. The growls grew louder, more guttural, reverberating through the crowd. Reed's eyes never left Harrison. He was determined to break the guard's calm composure. The tourists around him began to stir uneasily, unsure whether to back away or to continue watching. Reed was like a conductor orchestrating a performance, with the crowd as his audience and Cupcake as the instrument of chaos. Every move was designed to draw attention, to make Harrison crack. But the more Reed tried, the more the guard seemed to remain untouched, an unshakable pillar in the center of the storm. Harrison, ever vigilant, stood motionless. His eyes remained forward, locked in that unwavering, distant gaze he had learned to perfect over years of training. He could feel the tension rise, hear the growls growing louder with each passing second, feel the weight of Reed's provocation pressing in. But he did not react. Not an inch, not a muscle. Reed's face grew darker as the crowd murmured with a mix of fear and excitement. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, and it only fueled his determination. "You think you're tough, huh? A statue who just stands there." Reed's voice cut through the air, dripping with challenge. "Well, let's see how long you last when I unleash Cupcake on you." His words were sharp, almost mocking. He wanted Harrison to flinch, to break character, to react in some way. He wanted the tourists to see that even the mighty royal guard could be rattled by a man like him. But Harrison, like the statue he resembled, remained unaffected. The only sign of life was the faintest twitch of his jaw, no more than a muscle memory of discipline. Reed was running out of patience. His breathing grew heavier. His chest rising and falling with the strain of holding back his anger. The crowd continued to grow, some pulling out their phones to capture the spectacle. It was no longer just about Harrison and Reed. It had become a scene, a spectacle, a challenge for the tourists to watch. Reed had succeeded in drawing more attention to himself, but in doing so, he had also made himself vulnerable. Enough of this. Reed shouted suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're going to let this dog go or what? Or do I need to make you?" He gave the leash another violent jerk, pushing Cupcake forward with renewed force. The bulldog's muscles rippled as it snarled, its eyes fixed on Harrison with a primal intensity. The crowd gasped. Reed's desperation was becoming palpable. He was no longer just trying to provoke Harrison, he was trying to dominate the situation, to make his mark in a way that left no doubt about who was in control. The tourists around him grew uneasy. Some were backing away, sensing the rising danger in Reed's actions. Others were too transfixed to move, drawn in by the escalating conflict. Harrison's role as the unshaken guard had become more than just a position, it had become a symbol. And Reed, in his growing agitation, was making that symbol stronger by the minute. The challenge was no longer just between Reed and Harrison. It was a challenge between two very different worlds, the chaotic, loud world of aggression and force, and the disciplined, controlled world of military resolve. Reed was the embodiment of chaos, while Harrison was the embodiment of control. Reed stepped forward again, this time with a more deliberate threat. He raised his hand, as if to give Cupcake the final push to break free of his leash. "You want to test me? Fine. I'll break you with my dog, then we'll see who's in charge here." The crowd fell silent, their eyes darting between the two men. The tension was suffocating. Reed was no longer playing a game. He was throwing down a gauntlet, challenging Harrison to respond, to give in, to give something, anything, to the relentless aggression he was pushing forward, but Harrison remained calm, his eyes unwavering. He had been trained for moments like this. He had faced down much more dangerous threats, much more intense provocation. But this was different. This was a test of willpower, not of physical strength. And Harrison knew that the only way to truly win was to stand firm, to refuse to be moved by Reed's bluster. "Take your dog and leave," Harrison said, his voice quiet but authoritative. "You are disturbing the peace, and this is not a place for your theatrics." Reed's face contorted with disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, the frustration overwhelming him. But then, in a sudden shift, he stopped. There was a moment of recognition in his eyes, the tiniest flicker of understanding. He wasn't winning. He was losing. And no amount of growling or barking from Cupcake was going to change that. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd watched, frozen in place, as Reed stood there, wrestling with his own pride. The challenge had failed. And as the tension began to fade, Harrison's quiet strength had won the day. Reed, without saying another word, released his grip on the leash, allowing Cupcake to settle back at his side. He didn't look at Harrison again. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. As the crowd began to slowly disperse, the murmurs started again, this time with a sense of awe for the royal guard who had stood unshaken, unmoved, even in the face of such provocation. They had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a battle of strength, but a battle of wills. And in that battle, it was clear who had emerged victorious. For Harrison, it was just another day at his post. Another test passed. Another challenge overcome. But for Reed, it was a hard lesson learned. Some challenges, no matter how loud or aggressive, simply couldn't break the guard. And sometimes, the greatest power lies in remaining silent, in standing still, and in refusing to react to the storm that rages around you. The tension in the air had reached its peak. The crowd was now fully aware that something far more serious than a playful taunt was at stake. Reed, having pushed Harrison to the very edge of his composure, saw this moment as his final opportunity to assert dominance. He had provoked the guard with every possible tactic, the growls of Cupcake, the vicious lunges, and the loud threats that echoed across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. But now, it was clear he was ready to take it a step further. With a deep breath, Reed barked the command, "Attack." His voice was raw, a mixture of frustration and finality. He pulled the leash once more, this time with such force that Cupcake, a powerful bulldog, surged forward like a battering ram. The dog's eyes gleamed with raw aggression, its body coiled with muscle and tension. The crowd gasped. Some stepped back instinctively, their hearts racing as they anticipated the imminent clash. The sound of Cupcake's paws striking the ground echoed like a drumbeat, the animal hurtling toward Harrison with the intensity of a predator. Reed had been waiting for this. He was sure now that Harrison would be forced to move, to react. His smug confidence seemed to fill the space between them, but Harrison did not move. In the split second before Cupcake's jaws snapped shut, something extraordinary happened. Instead of flinching or retreating in the face of the oncoming attack, Harrison dropped into a crouch, his body remaining fluid and controlled, as if he had been anticipating this exact moment for years. His movements were deliberate, practiced, and entirely calm. The instincts he had honed during his 8 years of military service now took over. The dog lunged at Harrison with the kind of raw force that could easily knock a lesser man to the ground. But Harrison remained steady, his body poised like a coiled spring. He shifted his weight, lowering himself into a deep crouch, just low enough to intercept Cupcake mid-flight. The dog's momentum carried it toward Harrison, its teeth bared in a snarl that seemed to promise destruction. But Harrison was ready. With the precision of a trained professional, Harrison extended his arms and caught Cupcake just before the dog could strike. But it wasn't a simple grab. Harrison used his knowledge of animal behavior and his understanding of pressure points, tactics he had learned from countless combat drills, to effectively control the dog's movement. He did not try to overpower the bulldog. Instead, he leveraged its own momentum, using just enough force to guide its aggression away from him. Cupcake's snarling jaws came within inches of Harrison's face, but instead of crashing into him, the dog was redirected. Harrison's grip was firm but gentle, applying pressure in just the right areas to keep the animal in control. The dog's aggression faltered, its body stiffening as it tried to break free, but Harrison's technique held firm. He had neutralized the attack not by force, but by skill. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, now gasped in awe. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. The confrontation that had seemed destined to spiral out of control had, instead, been calmly diffused by a man who had remained unmoved by everything Reed had thrown at him. Reed, standing in stunned silence, couldn't believe his eyes. His command, his final weapon, had failed. The dog, which had been the symbol of his aggression, now found itself helpless in the hands of the very man it was supposed to intimidate. He had been so sure that Harrison would react with force, that he would panic and fight back. But Harrison hadn't fought. He hadn't panicked. He had simply controlled the situation. Reed's expression flickered from disbelief to frustration as he yanked the leash, attempting to pull Cupcake back. But the bulldog, caught in Harrison's grip, was struggling against its restraints. Its growls turned into confused whimpers as it finally ceased its attack, recognizing that it no longer had a target to aim its aggression at. For Harrison, the world around him narrowed to a quiet stillness. He could feel the muscle beneath Cupcake's coat, the sharp tension in its body. He could feel its confusion, its momentary loss of direction as it fought the grip that held it steady. But Harrison, calm and composed, continued to apply just enough pressure to maintain control. Harrison's voice was calm as he addressed Reed, never breaking his focus. "You've lost control of your dog. I suggest you regain it." It wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact. Harrison wasn't telling Reed what to do. He was simply acknowledging the reality that Reed, in his aggression, had overestimated his ability to control the situation. Reed, now visibly sweating with frustration, tugged harder on the leash. But it was too late. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, began murmuring in disbelief. Some began clapping, others were pulling out their phones to capture what had just transpired. The narrative of the day had shifted from a simple provocation to a lesson in control, how a man could remain unbroken in the face of extreme aggression, and how true strength often came in the form of restraint, not retaliation. Finally, with a final tug, Reed managed to pull Cupcake back, the dog reluctantly following. But it wasn't with the forceful dominance Reed had hoped to project. It was with a hesitant, almost reluctant compliance. The bulldog, its primal instinct subdued by Harrison's expert handling, now seemed to regard the situation with confusion, as though it too had realized that the challenge had already been decided. Reed, realizing that his attempts had failed, stood in stunned silence. His pride had taken a serious blow, and his anger was no longer directed at Harrison. It was now inward, at himself, for underestimating the quiet strength of the Royal Guard. Harrison, without saying another word, stood back up to his full height, his posture as immaculate as ever. He had not moved to fight, but he had also not been defeated. He had demonstrated that sometimes, the greatest form of control was not to fight back, but to simply remain steady, unshaken, and unwavering. As Reed walked away, without a word or glance at Harrison, the crowd's admiration for the guard only grew. Harrison's composure, his ability to turn the tide of the situation without aggression or force, had been nothing short of masterful, and for the tourists who had witnessed it, the lesson was clear: in the face of chaos, the strongest are those who can remain calm and composed. And those who can control the storm without ever needing to stir the waters. Harrison had not just passed the test, he had taught everyone watching a powerful lesson in strength and grace under pressure. As the bulldog, Cupcake, snarled and lunged with all the ferocity of an animal pushed to the edge, Harrison's focus sharpened. The chaos of the situation, the growling dog, the shouting Reed, the watchful crowd, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the challenge in front of him. This wasn't a physical fight, this was about control. And Harrison had been trained for moments like this. The bulldog's raw power was undeniable. Its muscles rippled as it struggled against Harrison's grip. Teeth bared, eyes wild with aggression. Cupcake was a force of nature, a beast unleashed with a single command. Reed had hoped this would be enough to break Harrison, to provoke a response that would shift the power dynamics of the moment. But Harrison was not easily rattled. He didn't see an uncontrollable dog, he saw an animal in distress, an animal whose behavior could be managed, not through force, but through understanding and technique. In that crucial moment, Harrison's training took over. He shifted his stance, his body dropping into a crouch as he met Cupcake's charge with the quiet assurance of someone who had faced far greater threats. The dog's aggression was palpable, its every movement an instinctive reaction to Reed's manipulation. But Harrison, instead of panicking or retreating, applied his knowledge of animal behavior, particularly of pressure points and calming techniques used in dog training. As Cupcake lunged again, Harrison didn't try to overpower the animal. Instead, he allowed its momentum to carry it toward him. In that instant, he expertly caught the dog just beneath its chest, just behind its front legs. Using his own body to gently guide Cupcake's aggressive forward motion away from him, Harrison applied subtle pressure to the right pressure points along the dog's rib cage, just firm enough to redirect Cupcake's energy, to calm it without causing harm. The technique was quiet, almost invisible to the onlookers, but it was effective. Cupcake's snarls faltered as it was no longer driven by unchecked aggression. The dog's body stiffened for a moment, confused, unsure of what had just happened, but then, as Harrison gently but firmly maintained control, something remarkable occurred. The tension in Cupcake's muscles began to dissipate, the snarls softened, replaced by hesitant growls that grew weaker with each passing second. Harrison's hand, steady and composed, had begun to exert just enough influence over the dog's behavior to calm its instincts. The crowd, once on edge, now stood in stunned silence, watching as the dog's aggression slowly ebbed away, replaced by a growing sense of calm. Reed, standing just a few feet away, could hardly believe his eyes. He had expected Harrison to falter, to react out of instinct. He had wanted the guard to panic, to lose control, to make a mistake. But Harrison wasn't just handling the dog, he was understanding it. He wasn't merely managing the animal's aggression, he was calming it, using knowledge and technique to re-establish peace. Cupcake, once on the brink of a full-blown attack, now seemed to submit to Harrison's expert touch. Its body relaxed, its growls faded, and even its stance softened. The dog, which had been a tool of aggression, now rested, its chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. Its eyes, which had been filled with primal fury moments before, were now focused, almost docile, as it looked up at Harrison, no longer a threat, but a creature in need of guidance. Reed, whose face had twisted in frustration just moments before, now stood speechless. He tugged on the leash, pulling Cupcake back slightly, but the dog, no longer acting on instinct, hesitated. It was as though the bond between handler and animal had shifted. Harrison's calm and controlled approach had re-established dominance, not through brute force, but through understanding. "Take your dog," Harrison said quietly, his voice still calm but firm, "and leave." It wasn't an order so much as it was a final, unspoken decree. Reed could feel the weight of Harrison's control. Not just over Cupcake, but over the entire situation. The guard had proven that true power didn't come from intimidation or aggression, it came from the ability to remain composed and in control, even when the world seemed to demand otherwise. With a hesitant sigh, Reed finally loosened his grip on the leash. He had no choice but to give in. The crowd, once full of tension and excitement, now began to murmur with admiration for Harrison, who had remained unwavering in the face of aggression. The energy had shifted. The royal guard had not been broken, he had broken the cycle of provocation, and in doing so, had shown the crowd a far more powerful lesson than any confrontation with Reed could have provided. Reed didn't speak another word. He turned, the leash slack in his hand, and walked away. His pride was bruised, but his lesson was learned. He had tried to use a dog, a tool of aggression, as a weapon. But it was Harrison's quiet, controlled demeanor that had truly neutralized the threat. Cupcake, the bulldog, now walked beside him, calm and subdued, a stark contrast to the chaos it had been moments before. The crowd slowly began to disperse, still murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Some people had their phones out, capturing the scene, while others spoke in hushed tones, whispering words of respect for the royal guard who had stood unmoved in the face of aggression. As Harrison straightened up, returning to his post, he knew that the moment was over. But the lesson would remain. True control didn't come from dominating an opponent. It came from understanding them. It came from the ability to read a situation, to anticipate a response, and to remain calm no matter how intense the pressure. For Harrison, it had been just another day on duty. Another day where the strength of discipline and calm had outmatched the force of aggression. For Cupcake, it had been a lesson in trust. And for Reed, it had been a harsh reminder that the greatest power wasn't in barking orders or snapping leashes. It was in staying calm, composed, and always in control. Reed stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. His chest heaved with the remnants of his frustration, but it was now laced with a sense of defeat that he could not shake. The scene he had orchestrated, the confrontation he had provoked, had crumbled before his eyes. Harrison, with nothing more than a calm demeanor and controlled movements, had defused the situation entirely. Cupcake, the aggressive bulldog that had been Reed's weapon, was now docile at Harrison's feet. The tension in the air that had once been so thick you could feel it in your bones had vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence. Reed had tried everything, shouting commands, yanking the leash, using his dog as a tool of intimidation. But none of it had worked. The guard, James Harrison, had remained steady, his unflinching resolve and understanding of animal behavior leaving Reed powerless. For a moment, Reed just stood there, gripping the leash loosely in his hand. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their gazes shifting from the calm, composed Harrison to the man who had attempted to provoke violence. The crowd that had once been hanging on Reed's every move now murmured in admiration for Harrison, for his grace, his control, and his ability to handle what had seemed like an impossible situation. Reed's face burned with embarrassment, the realization dawning on him slowly. His attempts to dominate the guard had backfired. It wasn't Harrison who had lost control, it was Reed. His reliance on force and intimidation had failed, and now, all he could do was stand there, defeated. His dog, once an extension of his will, had been subdued by a single gesture. It was as if Cupcake, too, had realized that Harrison's authority was far stronger than Reed's aggression. Harrison, sensing that the moment had come to address the crowd, slowly released his hold on Cupcake. He stood tall, his posture still perfect, but now his calmness had a new purpose. He wasn't just a guard standing at attention. He was a teacher, ready to impart a lesson not just to Reed, but to everyone who had gathered to watch this strange and unexpected encounter unfold. Turning slightly to face the crowd, Harrison spoke, his voice steady and clear, carrying across the courtyard with ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. "What you've witnessed here today is an important lesson in the difference between authority and intimidation. Many people believe that force, fear, and aggression are the tools required to assert control. But that is not the case." The crowd fell silent, listening intently to the words of the man who had stood firm in the face of Reed's intimidation. "Authority," Harrison continued, "is not about dominating others or using fear to bend them to your will. True authority comes from understanding, patience, and respect. It comes from knowing when to step in, and when to allow calm to speak louder than violence." Harrison paused, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers. His words were not just aimed at Reed, they were a reminder to everyone who had gathered that leadership was not about force. It was about control, calm, and the ability to handle situations with dignity. And when it comes to service animals, Harrison went on, it's vital to understand their needs, their behavior, and how to properly manage them. Service animals are not tools of intimidation or weapons to be wielded. They are companions, trained to assist, and it's our responsibility to treat them with the same respect we expect from others. Reed shifted uneasily, the full weight of Harrison's words sinking in. He had been using Cupcake to project an image of power, to manipulate the dog as if it were an extension of his own aggression. But now, he could see the truth in Harrison's words. Cupcake wasn't just a dog, it was a living being that deserved understanding, care, and respect. Harrison's calm approach had proven that the best way to handle an animal, or any situation, was through control and trust, not through force and manipulation. Harrison turned his attention back to Reed, who still stood in silence, his pride bruised. "If you want to understand how to handle aggression," Harrison said softly, "it's not about meeting it with more aggression. It's about using calmness to re-establish control and trust. Only then can you truly lead, whether it's a dog, a person, or even a crowd." Reed's eyes met Harrison's, and for the first time, there was no defiance in his gaze, only understanding. He hadn't been broken by Harrison's words, but something in him had shifted. The dog he had tried to use as a weapon, the force he had relied on, was now under the control of someone who had never needed to raise his voice. It was a humbling realization. As Reed turned to leave, his head bowed slightly in quiet acknowledgement, Harrison straightened up. He didn't gloat, he didn't revel in the victory. He had simply done his job. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs of admiration now directed at Harrison, the man who had stood unwavering, showing them that true power comes from understanding, not from fear. Reed's defeat wasn't just in losing the battle of wills, it was in the realization that his approach had been flawed from the start. His reliance on intimidation and force had made him a prisoner of his own ego. And Harrison's quiet authority had been the key to breaking that cycle, showing everyone that strength, in its purest form, was found in the ability to remain calm in the face of chaos. As the crowd melted away, Harrison returned to his post, his expression unchanged. To him, it was just another day. But to the people who had witnessed this unusual encounter, it had been a lesson in authority, respect, and the true power of calm control. As Reed walked away, his head slightly lowered, the crowd stood still for a moment, processing what they had just witnessed. At first, many had been fearful, uncertain of the unfolding confrontation between the aggressive bulldog and the unshaken royal guard. When Cupcake had lunged toward Harrison, the tension in the air had been almost unbearable, and the onlookers had instinctively stepped back, some pulling out their phones to capture the spectacle. But now, as the minutes passed, something had changed in the way the crowd looked at Harrison. What had once been a spectacle of chaos was now transforming into something more profound. Harrison's unwavering calm, his expert control over the dog, and his dignified response had not only diffused the immediate threat but had also commanded respect. The crowd, which had once been nervously watching the situation unfold, now began to murmur in admiration. The guard was no longer a mere soldier standing at attention, he was a figure of quiet authority. The kind of leadership that didn't demand respect, but earned it. Cupcake, once snarling and aggressive, was now calm at Harrison's feet, its behavior no longer dictated by aggression but by the steady hand of its handler. The contrast was stark. It wasn't just the dog that had been transformed, it was the entire situation, and in the process, the crowd's fear had been replaced by a sense of awe. They had witnessed firsthand the power of true authority, the ability to lead not through intimidation, but through understanding, respect, and control. As the murmurs of admiration rippled through the group, the sound of approaching sirens broke the momentary silence. 2 police officers arrived at the scene, their presence commanding attention. The crowd parted to make way for them as they approached Reed, who was still standing with Cupcake by his side, the tension in his face now giving way to confusion and frustration. He hadn't won. And now, with the arrival of the authorities, it seemed that his actions were going to be held accountable. One officer stepped forward and addressed Reed directly. "Sir, you've been reported for disturbing the peace and for improperly handling a service animal. We've had complaints about your behavior, and we need you to come with us." Reed's face tightened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He had no defense. The crowd, once caught up in his theatrics, had now turned against him. The charge of misusing his dog, which had been the centerpiece of his aggressive behavior, seemed almost too much to deny. Harrison had demonstrated to everyone watching that true leadership came not from force, but from understanding, something Reed had completely misunderstood. The officer reached for Reed's arm to guide him away, and Cupcake, sensing the tension in Reed's own body, began to whimper slightly. The dog, once a weapon in its owner's hand, now seemed unsettled, as though it too understood that the situation had taken a different turn. The officers led Reed away, the crowd watching in silence as the man who had tried to intimidate a soldier was now being escorted by the law. As the police took Reed away, Harrison returned to his position, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time. The situation had been resolved, but the lesson was far from over. The crowd, once captivated by the confrontation, had witnessed something much deeper than a moment of tension. They had seen the true nature of authority, a concept that went beyond the physical, beyond the superficial display of strength. For Harrison, the lesson was simple. True authority didn't rely on fear, on force, or on manipulation. It relied on the ability to remain calm in the face of chaos, to understand the dynamics of a situation, and to use one's strength with purpose and restraint. His military training had not just taught him to stand still, but to read the room, to anticipate actions, and to respond with control, not aggression. He had faced Reed's challenge not with violence, but with patience, understanding, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing what truly matters. In this moment, Harrison had demonstrated the difference between genuine authority and coercion. Reed's attempt to use intimidation had crumbled in the face of Harrison's composed handling of both Cupcake and the situation. And in the process, Harrison had shown that true leadership comes from respect, not just for others, but for the animals we share our lives with. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their admiration for Harrison growing with each step they took. Some whispered about the calm strength of the Royal Guard, others commented on the way the situation had been handled so masterfully. A few people approached Harrison, thanking him for his composure and for teaching them such a valuable lesson without ever uttering a word of anger. They understood now that authority, when wielded properly, didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be forceful. It simply needed to be steady, resolute, and rooted in respect. For Reed, the day had ended in defeat. His attempt to break Harrison had backfired, and the charges against him would now weigh heavily on his conscience. But for Harrison, it had been just another day in which he had been tested, and just another day where understanding, patience, and respect had triumphed over fear and aggression. The lesson of the day had been clear for everyone to see. True authority is not about controlling others with force, it's about mastering oneself and using that mastery to guide, not dominate. And as the crowd began to scatter, their minds filled with the lessons of the day, they carried with them the memory of the Royal Guard who had taught them what it truly meant to lead with quiet strength, compassion, and authority.